Thank you, everyone who's joined online. I'm going to kick it off, if that's okay. So my name is Robbie Oppenheimer. I'm the Chief Product Officer with Loam Bio, and I'm going to talk through today some of the information we have about water and nitrogen after CarbonBuilder application. And so first up, just talking about why we care. We know that there are these current headwinds to Australian growers. Obviously, everyone is talking about it and in the news about the conditions in Iran and how that's affecting fertilizer prices going forwards. We also know from the Bureau of Meteorology that they're expecting below average rainfall, especially in the second half of this season. And so that's top of mind as everyone's going into this season. Am I going to be able to make the most of the inputs that I apply? And how am I going to manage the variation in rainfall? How can we overcome these challenges? These are some of the conventional levers that growers might have to pull, either in optimizing their application rates through variable rate fertilizer, or lowering application, or sowing more pulses in their rotation, and looking at strategies around stubble retention or their plant density to maximize the amount of every rainfall event that they receive. But as a whole, all of this reinforces the need to build greater resilience into our farming businesses. That's where we think CarbonBuilder plays a key role. So at Loam, we've developed CarbonBuilder, which is a fungal inoculum. It's a dry powder that comes in a packet like this, which can be applied directly to seed or to furrow. And that fungus grows through the soil, pulling particles together into soil aggregates, which has an effect on the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. I can talk through some of that data during this webinar. And as a whole, we think this is particularly important going into a season like the current one, where we have this spike in fertilizer prices and potentially low and variable rainfall. One way to think about CarbonBuilder is as an analogy with rhizobia. So people familiar with rhizobia, nitrogen-fixing bacteria that's applied either directly to seed or to furrow. CarbonBuilder occupies a similar niche around the root zone, growing out into soil. You can see it here with these black filaments, which are fungal hyphae, growing out into soil and being able to pull those soil particles together into soil aggregate. So that's physically what it looks like on a plant root. This is, you can see these spiderweb filaments under. These are the fungal hyphae growing through the soil, pulling those particles together. The reason that we care about that in terms of soil nitrogen and water is that if we have improved soil structure, we can then improve the water infiltration into the soil profile and the water holding capacity. And that occurs as you have these kissing points between soil aggregates. It's those little kissing points where water can be stored through capillary action on the sides of soil aggregates, and the porosity between and within soil aggregates that can cause greater water infiltration into soil. It also affects nitrogen cycling, as we'll see in some of the data from this presentation, because if nitrogen can be stored inside a soil aggregate, then it's less exposed to oxygen and other microbes that can cause the loss of that nitrogen as nitrous oxide through microbial respiration, and also less leaching of that nitrogen through the soil profile and loss over time. So again, turning to these broader trends about why we care, we know from, say, a geodesy update in the past that we're seeing rising input costs, and over the course of the last few decades, we've seen a decline in the natural soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, soil organic nitrogen in soil, which requires continually more application of fertilizer or a different source of that nitrogen through biological nitrogen fixation. We also have data from the Bureau of Meteorology showing lower annual rainfall. And on average, compared to a century ago, 1 degree higher temperatures. So that increases the evaporation rate that we'll see, and there's less input of rainfall. So this is a particular risk going forward for our cropping zones. The areas where we've seen higher annual rainfall are actually in these areas of Western Australia and Northern Territory. So in particular, we'll be looking at data that's related to nitrogen and water and how to overcome these risks to the resilience of farming businesses. So I mentioned before about how nitrogen can be stored stably in soil aggregates. And that's what I'd like to walk through on this slide. So we know we can have a nitrogen input into soil through fertilizer application or biological nitrogen fixation. That nitrogen can either end up in the plant and in the grain, or it can be lost through nitrous oxide back into the atmosphere, or nitrogen leaching through the profile. However, if it's possible to create a healthy soil structure with nice aggregation, nitrogen can stay in that soil less exposed to oxygen, which will cause that oxidation to nitrous oxide. So it will slow down the rates of loss of nitrogen. And that's actually exactly what has been seen with CarbonBuilder in these two peer-reviewed published studies. So at the University of Western Sydney, Professor Yelima Carrillo and her colleagues ran a growth chamber trial with wheat. And over the course of 18 weeks, they saw a decrease in total nitrogen in the uninoculated control. In contrast, when they had a range of 12 different fungal strains, including the strain in CarbonBuilder wheat, they saw that total nitrogen stayed the same and was actually maintained at harvest of those plants, despite the plants in this treatment having higher root mass, higher shoot mass, higher spike mass. They actually still had the same, or very close to the same, as the starting nitrogen levels for that trial. So they're protected from loss of nitrogen, and they ended with 8.4% higher total nitrogen at harvest. How can that happen? We've got wheat plants and a fungus. There's no fertilizer input, which is causing that increase. There's no biological fixation. These aren't rhizobia. So how can there be this increase in total nitrogen with wheat? The answer is the other observation they've done. So they've taken those soil samples at harvest and split them into different fractions based on the nitrogen that's in the particulate organic matter that's occluded in these soil aggregates, or that is bound to minerals. And what they showed was a 29% increase in the nitrogen inside soil aggregates. So this protection of nitrogen inside soil aggregates has reduced the loss over the course of this trial. In another study at the University of Queensland, in this case, a soybean small plot trial run on the CSIRO Gatton campus by Vijaya Singh and Ram Dalal at University of Queensland. In this case, it's soybean, so there's the potential for biological nitrogen fixation over the course of that small plot trial. They saw a 20% increase in total nitrogen at harvest. That's quite remarkable, and that was combined with these treatments also having a higher grain yield, actually up to 18% higher grain yield with CarbonBuilder wheat applied. Again, there's this question about what's the mechanism driving this. They did the same analysis, splitting that soil sample at harvest into different fractions, and saw an increase, in this case, a 50% increase in the nitrogen inside soil aggregates. And additionally, they saw more nitrogen bound into the mineral-associated fraction. So when that nitrogen is bound to a clay surface. They're the interactions that slow the turnover of nitrogen in soil and lead to more nitrogen being available for subsequent crops. And if you're stepping back and thinking more generally, people talk about fertilizer application and whether it's 30% or 40% of that nitrogen that's applied ends up actually in the crop. It's exactly this kind of interaction which will increase the nitrogen use efficiency of the nitrogen that's being applied, which is particularly important in this season as people are looking at, do I decrease my input costs? Now, one of the questions which we've been asked in the past, and maybe someone has in the
You wanna have breakfast?
sorry, was that a question from the audience? If it's okay, would you be able to put it in the webinar chat? And we'll definitely get to it at the end of the webinar, if that's okay. One of the questions we've received in the past has been about, okay, this data looks great. If there's more nitrogen in these stable pools, is it less available to plants? Will we actually see a decrease in crop yield because that nitrogen is no longer available to plants? So an interesting analysis, this was the final figure in this Nature Scientific Reports paper from Vijay Singh and colleagues, was this correlation of the carbon inside soil aggregates with grain yield and the nitrogen inside soil aggregates with grain yield. And so what you'd expect if that nitrogen was being sort of locked up and was unavailable to plants, you'd expect a trend where the more nitrogen is in those pools, the less grain yield you'd got. That was actually the opposite of what they observed. The improvement in soil structure, the increased amount of nitrogen inside soil aggregates corresponded to higher grain yields, which is obviously a really exciting result. Moving from some academic work to some of these large-scale strip trials, where we can see what happens at commercial scale. These are strip trials on the order of 30 to 40 hectare scale. And the trial design for these, so you're able to follow along, is basically treated, untreated, treated, untreated, treated, untreated, alternating strips across a paddock with CarbonBuilder application, the commercial CarbonBuilder formulation in the treated strips, and an uninoculated control with obviously the same variety and same fertilizer treatments and everything else held constant. We've gone back year on year for 3 years in a row at these sites, which were started in 2023. And so the specific CarbonBuilder product has changed. In 2023, it was CarbonBuilder barley, 2024, CarbonBuilder canola, CarbonBuilder wheat, but the treatment strips have stayed the same, and the untreated strips have remained untreated over that period. And so in these two trial locations, we can see at Buller Farms have run on their trial farm at Palamalawa 3 years of CarbonBuilder applications, and these are showing the yields over that time. Baker Ag near Forbes have in that period also shown an increase in yield. This image from Pali is in 2024 via drone. And in that case, in that season, they saw earlier flowering in that canola crop and larger biomass. In Forbes, in the 2023 and 2024 seasons, looking via NDVI satellite imagery, we can see the same sort of trial design where we've got treated, untreated, treated, untreated, treated, untreated strips left to right. And in that mid-season period around June to July, we've been seeing a really stark difference in the NDVI, which doesn't appear earlier as the crop hasn't matured, and then evens out as the crop moves from vegetative phase through to reproductive phase. What's really interesting looking at this data, there's 2 points which stand out. First is that for any individual year, we haven't seen statistical significance, even when there's been very large increases like this 11% increase in yield. And part of that's due to the nature of doing a test when you only have 5 treated and untreated strips. So there's a low N and the potential for different soil types across that area. However, when you stack together that data year on year from 2023, 4, 5, we do see statistical significance as that N increases. Another really interesting point is that 2023 was the lowest rainfall year. So it had below average rainfall for Palamalawa and Forbes. They're the 2 years where we see the greater than 10% increase in crop yield. So again, that's really interesting, especially in areas north of Orange, New South Wales, where I'm based today. That's particularly interesting going into this season to think what we can do in a dry year. I said at the start that we'd talk about nitrogen, and this is a really interesting view of those 3-year trials where we've taken the soil samples after 3 years of application. So this is actually in January, just 2 months ago, after 3 years of application at Pally and Forbes sites, and then measured the nitrate nitrogen and ammonia nitrogen. They're summed together and plotted on this vertical axis here. So we can see what's the plant available nitrogen going into the 4th year of these trials. And what's really interesting is seeing at these 2 sites a large increase in plant available nitrogen, which will be available to those crops. What's interesting, we've got another site which 2025 was its 1st year of application. In that single season, we haven't yet seen an increase in plant available nitrogen, but that's something we're expecting to build over time as we have these effects on soil structure, improved total nitrogen, and therefore through the increased total nitrogen pool, an increase in the plant available nitrogen. This is jumping back from large-scale field trials to an assay which was done in the lab here in Orange, New South Wales by Anders, one of our mycologists in our team. This is sterilized sand that then has had the addition of 100 mils of water. The sterilized sand has been incubated with no fungal spores on the left and with fungal spores for 4 weeks. And so during that period, the fungus has woken up, grown through the soil, caused a physical change in the soil structure, so that after applying 100 mils of water, you can see most of it flow through and actually pull off some of the brown colored sediment here, whereas in the treated pots, there's less water that has flown through. And the tiny bit, if you look very closely, you can see a tiny sort of drip coming on this side. It's actually much more clear, which indicates less leaching and pulling off of minerals and dust and dirt from this sand. And just to manage everyone's expectations, this is proof of concepts in the lab, high dose rate of this fungus, higher than the commercially applied dose rate of the fungus, and grown just for a 4-week period. But what I'm trying to communicate here is how a fungus can change the physical structure of a soil and have these dramatic effects on the cycling of water, the cycling of nitrogen, and the cycling of carbon, which obviously, if you step back, can give a farm more resilience in the face of increasing input costs and potentially drier season ahead. The immediate question I'm imagining is in your mind is, okay, this is nice and well and good. What actually happens in a field trial? Do we see any effects on water in the field? And we do. This is from the same trial location that I just talked about earlier, the Palamalawa Bulla Farms trial, the one that had the canola drone image up on the slides before. So after 2 years of CarbonBuilder application, Ned Scan from OptiSoil went out to these sites and measured the water infiltration rate and at saturation of that soil profile. And what he observed was an increase in water infiltration in the 0 to 10 centimeters. This is really exciting because, again, if we're going into a dry season, being able to capture more of that water through the profile is obviously going to lead to more plant available water through the season. We've seen not just an increase in water infiltration, but an increase in water holding capacity. So for any given soil type or texture, this can be assessed by looking at the field capacity or the upper limit of water that soil can hold before it's saturated, and the lower limit, the permanent wilting point. This obviously differs by soil texture because, for example, clay is able to hold onto water more tightly, and so it has a higher total capacity, but also a higher permanent wilting point. And so the difference between these two, the upper saturation, the lower permanent wilting point, that's the plant available water during a season. And so at any point with a rainfall event, that water profile is obviously increasing up towards the field capacity and then decreasing over a dry period. And so what we did in a similar strip trial design, just as the ones that I've shared before, but this was actually in Elmore, south of New South Wales. So in Elmore, we measured the plant available water at harvest after a year of CarbonBuilder application. There were 50 soil samples taken across that whole trial design with treated, untreated strips. And with a p-value 0.02, we can see a 1% increase in plant available water. Just to be clear, there was no change in the permanent wilting point, which was measured separately. There was a 1% increase in the field capacity, which corresponded to this 1% increase in plant available water. That doesn't sound like much. What's a 1% change? What does that mean? And just to give that some color, if there was a 1% change throughout a meter profile, that would correspond to being able to hold on to an additional 10 millimeters of rainfall. Jumping back to some of the context I was showing at the start, that's the kind of change that we've seen since from the bomb slide, 1970 through to now. On average, a lot of our broadacre cropping areas are receiving 10 to 20 millimeters less rainfall. So being able to hold on to the rainfall we get is particularly important. It's obviously driving some of the yield increases that we're seeing with CarbonBuilder application. This is the single year Balata strip trial that I mentioned earlier. So this was the data where after a single, no, apologies, this is a different strip trial. So this is also at Balata, but this is a multi-year strip trial run by Outlook Ag. And in this one, it's particularly interesting because they've done an analysis by soil type that we haven't done before internally. And so we've really appreciated working with them and learning from them through this analysis. So same trial design where they had alternating treated, untreated, treated, untreated, treated, untreated strips in about a 30 hectare area. And in that, they had CarbonBuilder canola in the treated strips in 2023, CarbonBuilder wheat in 2024. It's had a fallow period in 2025. Be really interested to see what's going to happen if we come back in 2026 at that location. But the analysis they did was to split up that trial area by soil type using this red, green, blue index through PCT Cloud to look at the heavier soils, which are in orange, and the lighter soils or sandier soils in blue. And so that index is what it looks like across that trial area. So showing that if you're in a large enough area, you're able to span some different soil textures. And what's interesting is that then if you plot those out, so this is the heavier clay soil or the orange across that strip trial, 0.47, so that's the blue in this trial area, is that they can see the CarbonBuilder treatment effect has an interaction with soil texture. And so in this year, in 2023, they've seen a modest yield increase, 5.8% increase in canola yield in the heavier soils and a much larger increase in the lighter soils. So at the end of that year, looking at that, we were like, oh, okay, brilliant, job done. That's great. Better performance in sandier soils, which is not that simple because they went back the following year, same operators, same paddocks, same treated strips, and used CarbonBuilder wheat. And in fact, saw the opposite trend. They saw a modest increase, 2.1% increased yield in the lighter soils, and a much larger increase in the heavier soils. So it's a bit of a head scratcher. What can be going on with the same product, same operators, and so on? The real difference that we see between these 2 years is that 2023 is a below average rainfall season. 2024 was an above average rainfall season. So how does that interact with these two? What that means is that in the lighter soils, where there's more leaching through the profile, this is where plants are struggling. And that's where they don't have enough access to water. That's where there's faster evaporation through the larger pore space in the lighter soil. And so that's where we see the greatest yield increase. In contrast, in the wetter year, plants aren't struggling here in the lighter soils. There's more than enough moisture in a higher rainfall year, and we've got a larger increase in yield actually in the heavier soil. So what this means is that it's actually lifting up the bottom area of the paddock. In both years, there's actually a consistent story here, which is relieving plant abiotic stress in the areas of the paddock where that plant is struggling. And this is kind of expected. We see microbial responses like this because where plants are struggling, they tend to send out higher levels of signals to recruit soil microbes. And so that's why we see a greater treatment effect in these areas. Also particularly relevant as we're going into a drier season, again, as with the other multi-year strip trials, the largest increase in yield, the highest net return per hectare was in the drier year. So particularly relevant going into this season. If we zoom out from individual trials and look at trials across locations and years, this is a summary of Loam's small plot trials. So these are smaller scale than the previous work that I was sharing. These are like the national variety trials and often co-located with some of them. So these are 2 by 12 meter plots replicated across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia between 2021 and 2025. And if we look across that data, we can see an increase in carbon stocks between sowing and harvest for each of those individual trials. With that increase in soil carbon stocks, we also tend to have seen an increase in nitrogen. We haven't measured that for each of these locations except for the pulse trials in 2025, where across 10 small plot trials in CarbonBuilder pulses, we saw an increase in 12.5 kilograms of total nitrogen per hectare in comparing CarbonBuilder treated strip plots with untreated plots. Over that course, we've also seen an average 94 kilograms per hectare increase in yield, which is similar to the strip trial results we were just looking at previously. That then corresponds to a yield increase in terms of dollars per hectare, about $40 per hectare. As before, I mentioned in a few of these strip trial locations, we've been tending to see a higher yield increase in a drier season. What does that look like over time? So this slide is modeling out a 5-year rotation, assuming that in year 1 you have canola, wheat, barley, pulses, wheat, and then plotting out the yield uplift over that period, plus the nitrogen savings in the pulse year, which is what I just mentioned before, the 12.5 kilograms of total nitrogen per hectare, taking out the CarbonBuilder cost over that year. So $25 per hectare is the retail price for CarbonBuilder, and the decent net return per hectare over the course of that 5-year rotation. And that's similar in magnitude to what we've seen from those multi-year strip trials. So just starting to wrap up and say, what's out there and what's available. CarbonBuilder is available in retail stores in 2026. If anyone has been following Loam or working with Loam in the past, they'll know that we also participate in the ACU Carbon Project scheme through a service called Second Crop. These things have been decoupled because we've got some growers who want to go into a carbon project. That's great and that's fine. If that's for you, get in touch. If that's not, and you just want to have access to the fungus and have try it out on a large number of hectares this year, they've been decoupled and CarbonBuilder is available in retail stores. It's available as a seed treatment. It's also available as a furrow-mate formulation. If seed treatment is too much of a labor cost and inconvenience during sowing, we have invented a device called a furrow-mate that can be retrofit onto air seeders to dose out the powder into the airstream. And some of our larger growers, over thousands of hectares, up to 12,000 hectares, this is the reason that they use CarbonBuilder, because furrow-mate application makes it far easier and more convenient to apply. Another big piece of news coming into retail in 2026 is that we are launching CarbonBuilder pulses. This is our first year with a CarbonBuilder pulses product, which has the full rosé compatibility with lentils, lupins, chickpeas, and fava beans. Everyone who's on the call, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate the questions that were asked. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.